Funding for this program was provided in part by the Division of Continuing Education at Brigham Young University.
We welcome you to another roundtable discussion of the Doctrine and Covenants. I'm Matthew Richardson, Associate Dean of Religious Education at Brigham Young University. Joining me today are my colleagues from the Department of Church History and Doctrine, also at BYU. Across the table, we have Dean Garrett. Welcome, Dean.
Thank you. It's really good to be with you today.
It's nice to have you. And John Livingstone.
Good to be here today, too.
Welcome, John. And Craig Manscill. Welcome, Craig.
Thank you.
It's good to have you, brethren, here. Today we will be studying Doctrine and Covenants, section 101, 103, and 105. Now, brother, one of the first questions will come is, did I say that correctly? And I did, actually. The reason we're taking these sections is because they fall into a good sequence dealing with Zion. The saints, of course, are having quite a bit of trouble in Missouri, and then there is talk of redeeming Zion. And so these all deal with that, whether we look at why things are happening in Zion, what to do about it, and then the redemption in form of Zion's camp. We'll talk about all those. Craig, why don't you start us off and frame us up a little bit with section 101?
Sure. Section 101 is addressed with the date of December 16th of 1833. By this time, the saints have been driven out of Independence, Missouri, and they've crossed the river, and they're over in Clay County. Now, they're wondering which way to go. Do we stay here in Clay County? Do we come back up to Kirtland? Where do we go? And they're sending word up to Joseph by via of some of the brethren going up, Parley P. Pratt, getting the reports. So Joseph is contemplating what's our next move. And there's a wonderful letter that we have that gives the indication of what Joseph is thinking about. He's searching for the revelation. And I'm quoting now Joseph Smith. "There are two things of which I am ignorant, and the Lord will not show them unto me, perhaps for a wise purpose in himself. I mean in some respects, and they are these, why God has suffered so great a calamity to come upon Zion, and what the great moving cause of this great affliction is. And again, by what means he will return her," meaning Zion, "back to her inheritance."
Yeah, that's a good point. As a matter of fact, that's a great springboard jumping into 101. Is the question again, as you were saying, is why has this happened? And the Lord does come straight out.
So 6 days later, then this revelation comes, and Joseph's answer, what he was looking for.
And that answer comes straight to the point, doesn't it not? I mean, let's jump in 101 verse 2. "I, the Lord, had suffered the affliction to come upon them, wherewith they have been afflicted in consequence of their transgressions." Kind of, any questions on that one? I mean, really, when it comes down to it. And I don't think it's to minimize the saints, but to be able to be truthful and straight to the heart and say, here is the problem at hand.
I think sometimes we're tempted to blame the Missourians on this, but it's clear from what the Lord's saying that the members themselves had some issues.
Good point.
The Missourians had their problems, but the saints too. And you look at verse 4 and 5 and 6, where he talks about the need to be chastened and tried as Abraham, and was commanded to offer up his only son. And all those who will not endure chastening but deny me cannot be sanctified. And then he gets right to a point what they did wrong. "I say unto you, there were joins, contentions, and envies, and strifes, and lustful and covetous desires among them. By these things they polluted their inheritance." And I find that very interesting. The big sins that we think about, the adultery and the murder and the stealing and the robbing, they weren't doing those things. It's the things we don't pay a lot of attention to, the joins, contentions, and envies and strifes and stressful and lustful desires.
Excellent
That's
point.
what stopped them from being Zion people.
We'll even jump in verse 7. "And they were slow to hearken unto the voice of the Lord their God. Therefore the Lord their God is slow to hearken to their prayers." We saw that in the Book of Mormon when you get into 1 Nephi chapter 17, the age-old discussion between Laman and Lemuel. Swift to do iniquity, slow to hear the words of the Lord. And one of the beautiful things about this, though, is even though the Lord is straight to the point, I think comes in verse 3, he still is inviting back. "Yet I will own them." You know, I can't help but think of the notion of the word peculiar, which comes from the Latin peculum, which means purchased. I will purchase them. I'll own them. And then I like this part in verse 3, "And they shall be mine in that day when I shall come come to make up my jewels. They'll be my jewels.
I still love them. I still want to bring them back into the fold. And while they've had their difficulties, they're my children.
Good point. Good point.
I think we tend to see things sometimes in black and white. People are either good or they're evil, something like that. I think it just shows that the Lord is willing to work with us. These were all new members of the church. They're neophytes. And as they try to live these laws of Zion and be better people, well, it's clear they've got some rough spots, need to be taken care of. The Lord's on their side.
I think also you'll notice in here an important concept that to become a Zion people is more than just being a good person. It's a higher standard that he's putting on. We don't think too much about Zion contention, that type of thing. But if you're going to be a Zion person, if you're going to build Zion or be in a Zion society, it's going to take more than that.
I think that's a good point because we're living in a society today where in some ways we're becoming enamored with ethical behavior. All that matters is that we're nice to each other. We say hello, we help each other with a flat tire or something nice. But there is no way that we can undo the doctrines of a Christ. We love the ethical actions of Jesus, but sometimes fail to forget there are doctrines of the Savior Christ. And that's a good point, Dean, because we see that throughout this whole experience.
And one of those doctrines that you're talking about is verse 4, therefore they must needs be chastened and tried, even as Abraham.
That's right.
So this trying, in a sense, these saints down there are saying, well, this is Zion. I mean, this is, the inheritance of the Lord, the second coming. And now we've lost the land. Was that our fault? And it was in a sense, they were telling the people, the Missourians, this is a problem. You've taken our land from us.
It's one thing to have a place Zion. It's another thing to be a people Zion.
Right.
And, I think in the family, we see a similar sort of pattern. Why, once you're married in the temple and you're having babies, why, that's just how it should go, right? There shouldn't be any problems. But my goodness, pretty soon as children get older, there are jarrings and contentions. and I mean, you've got to solve those things if you're really going to make it.
That's right.
Well, what can we do about this? I mean, if we've been in that situation, well, what can I do when I see jarrings? What can I do when I'm in calamity, etc.? And I love the way that the Lord schools His children. We come over, for example, in verse 12. And in that day, all who are found upon the watchtower, or in other words, all mine Israel shall be saved. And they that have been scattered shall be gathered, and they who have mourned shall be comforted, and they who, verse 15, have given their lives for my name shall be crowned. Therefore let your hearts be comforted concerning Zion.
I like 17, Zion shall not be moved out of her place, notwithstanding her children are scattered. Sometimes when things seem so bleak and so bad, maybe we have a child that's just gone off somewhere. And boy, this kind of assurance is wonderful personally, as well as it must have been for Joseph and the others who felt like, oh my goodness, where are we at now?
And not only an assurance, but an important factor of understanding what it means to have a watchman on the tower, of someone with a different vantage point. And I'm sure that sometimes the saints in this situation or other situations we've been talking about might not see the relative importance of perhaps the counsel that's coming from a living prophet. Well, what does that really have to do with this? Well, what in the world could dress standards, for example, or the way that I'm holding family home meeting, etc., really deal with the issues at hand?
It was a comforting verse here, 17. The idea that the watchman on the tower in 12 is being talked about. And it's such a comforting verse. The doctrine's still there. Zion shall not be moved out of her place. That hasn't changed. Notwithstanding, her children are scattered. Even though they're over in Clay County and they've been scattered, Zion is still Zion. That's a comforting thought from the watchman.
And good point. Good point.
I was going to say, the Lord's pretty steady here. Look at 20. There is none other place appointed than that which I have appointed. Neither shall be there any other place appointed. He talks about Zion. Then he's going to establish this principle of stakes. Where is that?
Verse 21.
Verse 21.
22.
Yeah, and they shall be called stakes for the curtains or the strength of Zion.
Now notice also importantly too in verse 22 is the fact that those who call on His name and worship Him according to His everlasting gospel will gather together in these stakes and stand in holy places. And you tie that back to section 45 where He commands to stand in holy places, and section 87 where He's talking about war be poured out upon all nations and stand in holy places. And one of those places you stand in is the stakes of Zion.
Good point. Stand in holy places and be not moved. You go back into verse 17, is Zion shall be not moved out of her place. Boy,
And so it
confidence in
becomes
this.
Zion and her stakes of Zion, and we don't move. We don't move.
Good point.
He kind of points out the Zion condition of the second coming here, the millennium. Verse 23, prepare for the revelation which is to come, when the veil of the covering of my temple and my tabernacle, which hideth the earth, shall be taken off, all flesh shall see me together. Won't that be an event?
Oh.
Yeah, and that's the reference in 22 to stand in holy places is the temple. And during difficult times of war, the home is a temple for us as well.
And as we're building this, Zion, in light of the conversation we're having here, then we come over to verse 39, talking about called to my everlasting gospel, a covenant with an everlasting covenant. We cannot remove the covenant from Zion. It seems obvious there. They are accounted as the salt of the earth and the savor, not savior. It says they're the savor, S-A-V-O-R, in verse 39, of men. They are called to be the savor of men. Therefore, if the salt of the earth shall lose its savor, it shall be good for nothing and cast out and trodden underneath.
Yeah. Notice how you become the savor. That's by keeping the covenants. And by not keeping the covenants, you no longer are the savor.
That's right.
And then you're cast out.
And that's an interesting point of what's happening in an undercurrent here throughout section 101 is, once again, is it I, Lord? Let's look at what's happened. The saints going here is that flavoring that they add to men is by being distinct. I remember Elder AC giving a talk once where he mentioned that the way that salt loses its savor is by contamination. It's mixture. Right. So you lose the purity, which obviously is what's happening where he uses the word polluting their inheritance. There's something else coming into their inheritance besides the pure essence of what Zion was.
Or not keeping their covenants.
Yes, that's right.
They were.
Good.
It's important to remember, too, you do not put cups full of salt on your hamburger. You just sprinkle it. And, as Latter-day Saints, we are sprinkled around. And hopefully, there's some savor. We are covenant keepers. We're doing what we're supposed to do. I like verse 42 when he kind of gives us a caution. And he that exalteth himself shall be abased. He that abaseth himself shall be exalted. He's kind of telling us how to lose our savor, or how to save our savor, I suppose.
And then true to form, jumping right into a parable notion here of the redemption of Zion. And this is quite a lengthy parable, and we see it being framed all the way from 44. We see it through 56, and then some of the analogy going on. Let's just frame that up very briefly. What's happening here? What the point of the parable? Why it would be given here? Thoughts on that?
I have 12 fruit trees in my backyard. I love this Lord of the Vineyard who's got 12 olive trees. We're not growing olive trees, but he instructs them, that they're supposed to prepare things, and especially they're supposed to build a tower, which they do not do. And then because they have not done that, there's an attack. And of course, then they have to account to the Lord of the Vineyard for why no tower was built.
It's interesting in the context of the Revelation with what's going on in Kirtland and other places. What's the tower?
Is it the temple?
Yeah, it's the temple in
of
Kirtland. And they haven't quite got to that point where they've really put their heart and soul in building that temple yet.
Dean, I'm glad you bring that up, because here we're talking about breaking covenants, and you start to look at connection. Where you find Zion, you have covenants, obviously. Yeah. And where you have covenants and Zion, you will always find a temple.
Yeah. And see, why is that tower so important? You look at verse 54, it goes back to that tower, that watchman that we've just talked about. That watchman upon the tower would have seen the enemy while he was yet afar off. The watchman, of course, being the prophet. And that, to me, is a very, very important statement, because a lot of times we don't understand why prophets tell us what to do. We think there's something today that's happening, but in reality, the prophets, through the revelation and contact with the Lord, can see afar off. Mm-hmm. And they try to prepare us for things to come, as well as for living in today's society. And if we follow him, we'll be prepared. If we don't follow him, then we end up like these servants who lose it.
Verse 50 talks about those servants. While they were at variance one with another, they became very slothful. The South American three-toed sloth moves so seldom that algae is found growing on its stomach. I say to my students, have you checked your belly buttons lately? But these folks were having a problem.
Well, we look at that parable, and like all teachings, to teach a lesson, a principle, and then immediately following that, then we have a second parable. Perhaps dealing directly with some of the situations that are taking place in Missouri. And we start to see the parable of the unjust judge. We see that picking up in about verse 81. Now, unto what shall I liken unto the children of Israel? I will liken them unto the parable of the woman and the unjust judge. For men ought always pray and not faint. Right there, I think, is a great tidbit of advice, is constantly petitioning petitioning for help, constantly seeking some type of help.
Well, see, when you go back to to verse 8 and 9, you'll notice that's one of the things they didn't do when they were in Zion, because they, in the day of their peace, they esteemed lightly my counsel. To the end of trouble, they feel necessity to feel after me, and therefore, notwithstanding their sins, my bowels will be filled with compassion towards them. So that's what they didn't do, is in the day of peace, they didn't really call upon God. And when he's saying, now, you've seen what's happened, now, you call upon me and listen to me and trust me and do what I counsel you to do.
And he does give additional practical advice as well as petitioning God. Then it comes down, he says in verse 86, let them fall upon the feet of the judge. And if that doesn't work, go to the governor. And if that doesn't work, let them go to the president, which we see happening in 1839. You know, you see kind of some interesting experiences there where Joseph will visit President Martin Van Buren. But all these things in a situation, going through, praying, weeping. In verse 93 it says, what I have said unto you must needs be that all men may be left without excuse. Do everything you possibly can. There's no excuse. We petition.
And that's why Joseph asks the saints to collect their redresses, collect their property damage, so that they'll stand as a witness. And that's the idea of not being left without an excuse. They must go forward, collect the information, and still pay for Zion. While they're still to pay for land and collect land in Missouri.
Forge ahead.
I'm impressed with how the Lord wants them to do things in an organized way.
Yeah.
I mean, he really goes through a process. As a matter of fact, I think if you look at verse 95, he recognizes that the world may not see it the way he sees it, that I may proceed to bring to pass my act, my strange act, and perform my work, my strange work.
Not weird work, strange. You know, say a little bit more about that. Yeah, different than what?
Different than our thinking. His thoughts are not our thoughts, and his ways are not our ways.
It's like the term peculiar. Peculiar people. Again, not weird.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, I hate to say this, but we better move on. Let's take a look at Section 103. When we come to Section 103, we're dealing in February of 1834. Dean, will you mention a little bit about, or at least give us some historical framework on this one just briefly?
Well, again, in 101, we noticed the verses that promised that Zion was still in its place and will not be lost, and so on. The question, can it be redeemed? And so the brethren and the leaders of the church in Missouri, who are driven out of Jackson County now, will send Parley P. Pratt and Lyman White up to the prophet Joseph and ask basically that question. Should we go back and try to redeem it? What should we do? And if so, how do we do that? And Section 103 really is the answer to that petition of these two brethren coming up and meeting with the High Council, meeting with leaders in Kirtland, and getting directions to what to do. And 103 gives that direction, what could be done and should be done if Zion is to be redeemed.
We see that specifically, verse 1, I say unto you, my friends. I don't know why I always like that part. Whenever I read that in Scripture, my friends.
I want to be his friend.
Yeah,
Yes.
isn't that the truth? It's nice to have friends in high places, but it's nice to have a friend like that. He says, I say unto my friends, I give you a commandment, and as you were saying, Dean, I like the wording here, that ye may know how to act in the discharge of your duty concerning salvation and redemption of your brethren who have been scattered. Yeah. So here's how we are going to go about this and how we will act. And there's no doubt about it. In verse 4, it says that they have been chastened for a little season, and it has been sore and grievous chastisement because they did not hearken altogether. There's an interesting concept. Any thoughts on that?
Well, we hearken, but do we hearken all together? I like that word, and I worry about that word, really, as I hearken to him, but am I hearkening all together in everything he's telling me to do?
Good point.
It's almost as if the Lord is asking us to look at being a little more exact in how we live the commandments. You know how the stripling warriors, I think that's where we see exactness being spoken about in the Book of Mormon and the blessing that came to them. I look at verse 2 here. Look at the end of that. I will pour out my wrath without measure in mine own due time. Well, if these brethren could have seen ahead to the Civil War and the things that were going to happen as the Lord poured out his wrath, I wonder if they'd have appreciated what was going on there.
I think verse 5 really then starts to talk about the direction the Lord wants to take with this redemption of Zion. But verily I say unto you that I have decreed a decree which my people shall realize, inasmuch as they hearken from this very hour unto the counsel which I the Lord have given them unto them. Behold, they shall, for I have decreed it, begin to prevail against mine enemies from this very hour. So the Lord is prevailing against the enemies. He is setting things in motion that the saints don't even realize are about to happen.
And the warning comes in verse 8, but inasmuch as they keep not my commandments and hearken not to observe all my words, the kingdoms of the world shall prevail against them.
Yes. And it's interesting, and as you look at verse 7, there's an expansion of not only just Zion, but if you hearken to observe all the words I shall speak unto them, they'll never cease prevail until the kingdoms of the world are subdued under my feet. It's not just Zion in this. He's expanding this in those verses
A larger
to a
context,
larger
yeah.
context of what we're involved in today, really.
There's an interesting thought here when we move along in verse 15. Give me your thoughts on this. Behold, I say unto you, the redemption of Zion, here's the redeeming of Zion, must needs come by power. Any thoughts on that?
You know, I think no doubt it's got to be the Lord's power.
Okay.
In a sense, I think it's got to be miraculous. I think the Lord wants a groundwork laid very carefully, highly organized. He's going to invite them to buy lands and to do it in an organized way. But I think the Lord is going to direct the redemption of Zion almost personally.
Well, and I think that's the important part. And I know I was baiting a little bit on that question because sometimes the immediate response is, well, let's go down and we'll beat them up. We'll take it over. It'll be our power. But there is a power there, but I like what you said, John, is the Lord's power, because in verse 16 it starts to jump down and it says, I will raise up, unto my people a man. And then when you come to verse 21, and I say unto you that my servant Joseph Smith is the man whom I liken unto. It's the Lord's power through the Lord's prophets, seers, and prophets, through his means by which he established. And that's the way we come to Zion.
Right, and the power is obedience. This is going to be a schooling in obedience to redeem Zion. And that power, I think, has a lot to do with obedience to your covenants, obedience to following this man like unto Moses named Joseph, who's going to lead Zion's camp.
And it's not an obedience that's coming from, I'm scared to death if I don't do it. Because look at an attribute here in verse 27 when they start to gather the redemption is, let no man be afraid to lay down his life for my sake, for whoso layeth down his life for my sake shall find it again. In some ways, I look at that as a willingness, saying, oh, I want to be part of this, to whatever the stake is, a willing servant.
See, in verse 22, the Lord tells the prophet then to gather his young people and his middle-aged people into what we would classify as an army. But how's that army going to have its power? And where's that power going to come from?
I think one of the keys is in verse 28. He's really talking about discipleship. And discipleship ends up being the main issue of Zion's camp, I believe.
Yes, the follow.
Whoso is not willing to lay down his life for my sake is not my disciple. You know, my missionaries in inner city Detroit ever so often would have weapons pulled. And I would say, now, brethren, if that should happen to you, are you willing to lay down? What a great way to die. Make my spiritual
I'm
day.
sure parents are feeling much more at ease knowing that.
That's easy for you to say. You weren't down there with them.
That's true.
But you bring up a good point about the discipleship and gathering the army, and the Lord says, get together 500, and then he says, if not 5, go 3, go 100, and we gather, about 207 souls that will be part of that.
There's a point here, though. The Lord had a specific number in mind. He wouldn't have said 500 unless he knew there were 500 young men or middle-aged men ready to respond. And then the idea of obedience comes back. They never do gain 500. It's 207 or so.
That's right.
Obedience
You
was the
wonder-
principle there.
You often wondered what would have happened had they had the 500.
Yeah, one does wonder.
Maybe we would have been back to Zion. I don't know about
Well,
that.
then we have the army gathered, and we have the notion of a clarity, or at least a guidepost of how to redeem this Zion experience. They literally do leave. We come to section 105, which is dealing with that, to use your term, Dean, the army. Yeah. 207 souls or so, and going out, and they will be marching for around 900 miles. Just in a quick nutshell, John, why don't you frame this, and then we just have a few minutes to take a look at section 105.
Well, they recruited among the brethren, and sure enough, they raised those couple hundred brethren. They split them into 2 companies, kind of Hiram's, Joseph's. Hiram goes up through Detroit and then down. Joseph takes a little more direct route. By this time, on the Fishing River, which isn't a large river by any stretch of the imagination, but boy, they know that there's been mob violence. You can imagine what's going through the heads of some of those that aren't leaders. They're probably wondering if they are going to have to do battle. There's some real issues here, but again, the Lord's going to point out that this is really a spiritual process that's going on. No, not so much a blood and guts, duke it out battle that's about to occur here.
So if we cut to the chase, they march all the way down, get close to the Missouri border, and then what takes place? And this is really what 105 is at the heart is.
The Lord then says, okay, you've done far enough, let's go back home now.
Thanks for coming. You've fulfilled your mission. And here they had all that training coming down. And one of the senses that I like about this in section 105 is this principle dealing with anything with Zion is the Lord is in control, and I'm more interested in the ends rather than just the means. I want you to be more, I'm interested in obedience rather than going in and being able to literally reclaim. And we see that throughout these first few verses within section 105.
It's because of the transgressions of the people that they can establish.
That's right.
Take a look at verse 3. Is that where you were going?
Yep.
John, but behold, they have not learned to be obedient to the things which I required at their hands, but are full of all manner of evil, and do not impart of their substance as it becometh saints to the poor and the afflicted among them.
Yeah, and one might ask in that verse, obedient to what things? What things was it? And it's almost as if you get the sense here, it says, no, it's inconsequential of what it is, it's obedient. It doesn't matter what comes forth, it's to be learn to be obedient.
We make specific covenants relative to obedience, and it's early in our church membership. But in a sense, the Lord is laying the foundation of the church here. Yeah. And He must have an obedient people. I like verse 6, my people must needs be chastened until they learn obedience. And we ought to be able to take some chastening. We ought to be able to take a psychological or a physical shove every now and again and not respond in wild ways, but do it the way the Lord wants.
See, they've got that Zion cannot be built except it be upon the principles of the celestial kingdom. And if we're not willing to be obedient, we can't build Zion.
You're right.
And it's not just the people in Zion that's got a problem. It's the people in Kirtland in verse 8 who are supposed to support and help and send their monies, and that's in 103, send monies and people. And what's the Lord? And they're saying, where's their God? He will deliver them. And the Lord says, no.
I think
you must be obedient to my
It's an excellent point when we look at that, and really perhaps where we need to end is the notion of building Zion is dictated upon those principles, as you read in verse 5, of our Father in heaven's law, and in verse 10, that they may be prepared, that my people might be taught more perfectly, have experience, to know more perfectly concerning their duties. That's what we all are as saints in still, as Joseph Smith would say, trying to establish the cause of Zion.
That's correct.
Brethren, thank you for your comments.
Visit our website to find out more about the Doctrine and Covenants. Go to byubroadcasting.org. Funding for this program was provided in part by the Division of Continuing Education at Brigham Young University.